Hey there, it's Dr. Tom with EBM Fitness Solutions, and we're going to break down shoulder and neck pain when you're pressing overhead. A lot of different things to look at and break down in terms of why this is happening, and then how do you go about fixing it. So let's get into the first part, that overhead pressing is not inherently dangerous. It's perfectly fine to do. There are a bunch of reasons why it can be painful for a lot of different people, but in and of itself, overhead pressing is fine. And anybody who tells you that it's dangerous for any reason is misinformed. It can be based on a bunch of the things we're going to talk about, but by itself, it is definitely not a problem. So what's one of the biggest contributing factors to pain when pressing overhead? It may be something that you're not thinking about, it's your posture. Okay, so oftentimes overhead pressing and the pain associated with it has nothing to do with the exercise and has everything to do with your body's inability to get into a good position to press from. So most people have very poor posture and very poor postural awareness in terms of what position you think you're in versus what position you are actually in. Those are two very different things, and we're going to kind of break that down and talk about why it's important, what happens when things change, and then how do you actually undo those things and sort of make a difference in terms of your posture with overhead pressing. Just for argument's sake and just to get this out of the way now, when I refer to posture, at least for this example, and this is how I typically define it, we're going to talk about static posture is being able to get into this position right here, okay? If you can't get into this position, then we've got some postural abnormalities we need to address. So when I talk about sort of static posture, we're going to talk about this. I'm going to get into dynamic posture next, but if you can't get into the proper setup position statically, it's not going to get better when you start moving. So dynamic posture is more when you're moving and doing other things, and it's going to be your ability to hold your posture while you're doing those things. Static posture is literally being able to go up against the wall. Can you stand there? Can you get into that position? And then we kind of move from there. We'll talk about dynamic posture. So let's say you get up against the wall, you have the good posture, you're able to get there, awesome. Step one complete. Now your dynamic posture. Can you keep that general position while you move? For this example, and sort of what we're talking about here, it's overhead pressing, but in reality, if you get into that position, you can't hold it when you walk or when you squat, when you lunge, deadlift, push up, overhead press, then there are going to be problems. They may not plague you right away, but I can promise you they will at some point. So dynamic posture is your ability to take this position, right, up against the wall, good posture, good setup, and then do things without losing this posture. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to be a robot, and it doesn't mean that you can't move out of this to some degree, but generally speaking, you're going to maintain and hold that position while you're doing your overhead pressing. That's what we're going to refer to when I'm talking about static posture, dynamic posture. It's going to come back to that position. Can you get into it statically? That's the first thing. And then can you maintain it dynamically as you start moving around doing the overhead press? All right, so now we have to kind of break down that static posture position, whether or not you can get into it or not, and then start to figure out what some of the limitations might be. Sometimes it's actually pretty simple, other times not so much. So again, first thing we're going to look at, static posture. Can you get into this position? Up against the wall, good overall posture. Can you at least get to this position? That's the first step. Let's say that goes pretty well, but we're going to be overhead pressing. So now you have to be able to get your arms up over sort of above shoulder height to do the exercise. Can you get into this position? That's going to be the next step. So statically, can we do one? Can we do the other? And if you cannot, then what I'm going to have you do is, if you struggle up against the wall to bring your arms into this position, what I want you to do is I want you to lay on the floor, either at home, whatever, and then can you do this laying on the floor? Okay, so that's going to look like this picture right here. Okay, sometimes called the floor slide, but I want you to see, can you get into that position laying down? If you cannot do it standing, but you can do it laying down, what does that mean? Well, it's more of a positional thing. So when you're lifting your arms up like this, when you're standing, you're going up against gravity. So that means there's more muscular sort of constraints, could be some joint stuff, but if you lay down and all of a sudden your arms can go all the way flat, then joint restriction is pretty much taken out as a potential limiting factor, and it's purely muscular. When you lay down, you're in more of a gravity-assisted position. Gravity is pressing down on you when you're laying down. If you can get into that position much easier, then it shows that, okay, so you can get there, joints are not restricted, muscles they have assistance laying down, they've got more resistance when you're standing up. So it's more muscular movement, not joint restriction. So that's a very important distinction when we're looking at your setup in terms of your static posture. So let's say you're limited getting the arms against the wall standing, you lay down and you're still limited. The forearms do not get flat to the floor when you're laying down. What does that mean? Well, now this means you probably in some capacity have some sort of a joint restriction somewhere in the shoulder. Could be thoracic spine, could be scapular related, could be the glenohumeral joint. You have a lot of options at that point. But what it basically means is you're going to need some help from somebody else to loosen things up and to get you in a position where first you can be here on the floor, then hopefully get you close to being here up against the wall. But you're probably gonna need a little bit of assistance, a little bit of guidance to get through if you find restrictions both in standing and when you lay down flat. So we've talked about some posture stuff already, about how you need to be able to get into a certain setup before you should really do much overhead pressing. We're gonna start to break down some other reasons why you may struggle to get up against the wall, or even some potential reasons why on the floor you have a hard time getting yourself back. And it has to do with your thoracic spine. So the thoracic spine is kind of the middle part of your spine, cervical spine or your neck. You have your lumbar, which is your low back, and in between those two is your thoracic spine, where your shoulder blades kind of hang out, and it is oftentimes the hub of shoulder pain, neck pain, limitations in shoulder range of motion, and things that are going to limit you from being able to press overhead without pain. But why is that? It gets a little messy here, but this is why posture is kind of a big deal with these things. So your thoracic spine is in through here. What often happens for a lot of people that sit a lot, whether it's from commuting, computer work, staring at your iPhone or your tablet, is we tend to round forward. Now as we round forward, our head tends to drop and it creates this problem. But here's the deal. This is why it's a problem. So here's your thoracic spine in through here. All of your ribs come off of your thoracic spine. They wrap around and connect to the sternum on the front. So when the thoracic spine shifts, so do the ribs. The ribs kind of shift forward. Your shoulder blade sits on top of the ribs. It now shifts into a different position. At the end of your shoulder blade is the socket where it meets up with the ball here that kind of makes one of your shoulder joints. That now shifts forward. Now, not only are all those bones and joints shifted forward, but now you've altered sort of the muscles in terms of the muscles on the backside here are going to be overstretched. The ones back here, the ones in the front are going to be in sort of a shortened, tighter position. So all of that happens as a result of you kind of rounding forward. So the idea just sit up taller, stand up taller. Yes, that's the goal, but it's not that simple. You have to address mobility issues here first. So as you work on getting your posture up against the wall, you have to address this. Failure to address this is going to be a problem. It's going to be a big time problem for you, again, generally speaking, but we're talking specifically about overhead pressing. It's going to be a problem. I'm going to explain why next. So how does thoracic hypomobility or lack of mobility in your thoracic spine, how does that impact your ability to press overhead? Well, with all the things I mentioned before, all of that shifting and moving forward, what happens is I'll show you that if I lift my arm up here, no problem, right? Normal, full range of motion, no problems there. Now, if I round forward here, right, round my back, right? So now you can see my arm only gets up to here. Before it was here. So I create a block on my own by rounding my posture. My arm cannot go up any further. So now for me to overhead press when being rounded forward, I have to do other things. I have to really arch my back, which means most people are going to sit down to do this. We'll talk about that later, seated versus standing overhead pressing. And I'm going to have to do a bunch of things to compensate for this lack of motion. Now the problem is when your thoracic spine is tight, you can't simply just stand up because the spine is stiff. The joints, the vertebrae all kind of connect and have joints that connect to one another. they become sort of restricted. They don't move as well. So you lose the ability to just stand up tall like this. You have to work on doing some thoracic mobilizations. What the heck is that? And how do you do it? Well, take a look here. So this is one way to do it here. You can put a foam roller on the ground and you can sort of do the mobilizations over the foam roller on your own. It's something that, generally speaking, most people need and most people benefit from. They need to improve that mobility, and then that allows the posture exercises and the other things we're going to talk about to be more effective. You skip over this step, you're probably going to have chronic issues with the shoulders and the neck, and definitely will have trouble overhead pressing. So it's one of the first things that should be dealt with if you're having any issues with the shoulder and the neck. So sometimes your inability to press overhead or the pain associated with it is actually cause, or the contributing cause is the muscles around the shoulder and even up into the neck. They can have restrictions that are going to cause pain. So we have to look at what we call soft tissue mobilization. It's a fancy word for massage type work. So take a look at sort of the muscles in the back here. So they run from the hip and the low back area right up towards the shoulders. They run up to and connect to the back of your head. And there's other ones that are kind of buried in deep that you can't see, but there's a lot going on back there. And some of those have a greater role in limiting your sort of range of motion and the ability to move. And some are tied into some of the posture stuff we already talked about, and also tied into some of the thoracic mobility stuff that we've also discussed. So you have to address any soft tissue limitations in conjunction with the thoracic mobility and your overall postural awareness and your static and dynamic posture. And this is all before we really even have talked anything about overhead pressing, because that's the big mistake is people just press, they lighten weights, they try different versions of it, but they never address any of the underlying problems. If you fix the problems, your symptoms go away. It's quite simple. If all you do is keep throwing different types of presses at the shoulders when they're hurting, they're going to keep hurting. If you address the postural awareness, the thoracic mobility, and then you add in the soft tissue mobilization, you work on different muscles in the upper back and the shoulder area, then now we actually create a good environment, a good platform, if you will, to press from. But you cannot ignore those things, otherwise the pressing will continue to cause you pain. So how do you work on some soft tissue restrictions that might be going on in the upper back and the shoulder area? And one of the ways is using a device like this. So this is a TheraCane, and they make a bunch of other ones that look similar. And you can actually, if you know somebody or if you yourself have an actual cane, like a walking cane, you can do the same kind of thing with this. The opening is not as wide at the top of a sort of a walking cane, but I've used those before to do the same kind of idea, the same technique. These things, by the way, are fantastic. I have two here at EBM, and I have also one at my house. They work very, very well for what I'm about to show you. So a common area that gets tight is the upper back in between your shoulder blades. So what you do is you take this thing, and I'm going to show them to spin around here, and you take it and you go right in between or right along the shoulder blades, and you press. And you basically, you're looking for the sore spots. And when you find one, you just keep pressure on it. You don't have to like drag it up and down, right? You don't have to use it that way. Really what you want to do is kind of move around. When you find something, press, and then just hold it. And keep the pressure on it. 15, 20, 30 seconds, just hold it. Now, sometimes when you do soft tissue work, especially in the upper back area, it is not uncommon for pain to refer up into your head. It's called referred pain. So you'll press down in the shoulder blade area and you might feel pain that goes to the base of your skull. It feels like it's in your ear. It might wrap up to your forehead. Could feel like it's behind your eye. This is, I say normal. It's an abnormal response that the tissues are that hypersensitive, but the referral patterns are normal in the sense that they've been mapped out. It's actually pretty cool. You can press on one spot and it refers pain up into the head, neck, and shoulder. Basically the short take-home message here is don't freak out from that. That means you're on something that needs to be addressed, and you need to keep pressure on that spot, okay? Doesn't have to be maximal pressure. If you put a little pressure on and it's uncomfortable, just hold it. You don't have to like press as hard as you can, not required. Keep the pressure on, hold it for a little bit, and then move around and look for more sore spots. Don't be surprised if you find a whole bunch, and don't be surprised if some of those things are really nasty. So another way you can work on the muscles in the upper back is using a foam roller. So I have a roller that's right around my shoulder blade area. What I'm going to do is, there's a great way that you can position your body to really open up those muscles right along the shoulder blade area. So what I'm going to do is I always encourage people to support their head and neck with at least one hand. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to work on my left side, the side closer to the camera here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my right hand, keep it behind my head to support my head and neck. My left arm, I'm going to reach across my body, kind of put my hand almost into the armpit of the opposite side. Now what that motion does is it takes your shoulder blade and it pulls it away from your spine, okay? So that takes muscles that might have been covered up by that shoulder blade, and it exposes them because the shoulder blade is now slid out of the way. So you reach here first. Now I'm going to lift my hips up off the ground, and I'm going to roll onto my left side, because now all those muscles that were hidden by the shoulder blade, they're open for business. Now I can get in there and I can roll them out, where if I kept my arm back here, the shoulder blade can kind of slide back and it covers them up a little bit. So again, reach across the body, and then when you come, you're going to turn to that same side, and then you're going to roll right along the shoulder blade area, and you're going to find some spots that would have otherwise been covered up by the shoulder blade. So there's shoulder pain with overhead pressing. The question now we can look at is, well, are you doing them seated versus standing? Is one better than the other? If you have shoulder pain, should you be doing one versus the other? And again, unfortunately, like most things, it kind of depends on a number of the things that we already talked about, right? The soft tissue mobilization, your thoracic mobility, your overall posture. But sitting down, I should say, seated overhead presses do give you some ways to work around things a little bit more than standing does. But there's also things you can do to cheat around that. So let's jump into and take a look at the seated overhead press. So let's take a look at the seated overhead press. So you're going to be sitting typically on some kind of a bench with the back brought up that typically is slightly angled back. It could be completely vertical. It won't really matter too much. Here's the rub on that, or the trick. So if you think about pressing on a bench, right? So if you lay the bench all the way down flat, right? That's a bench press. The more you incline the bench, the more difficult the movement becomes. So if this is completely vertical, it's going to be more challenging than if you laid the bench all the way flat and it was horizontal. So when you kick it back one click like this, it does make the movement, relatively speaking, a little bit easier. So keep that in mind, that if you lay it back too far, basically it was more of an inclined chest press, but having a slight lean back might be a little bit easier to kind of set things up. But seated overhead presses, and listen, both are fine. Seated overhead presses versus standing overhead presses, both are good, right? Now, seated does allow you to have to focus on fewer things because you're sitting down. The bench is supporting you. There's less sort of less body mechanic things you have to worry about. But there are things that people often do that can contribute to their shoulder pain while they're overhead pressing. And this would be true. I will talk in a later video about barbell overhead pressing versus dumbbells versus kettlebells and things like that. But the basic idea here is that one of the issues what people do is when they're here, they arch their back even more. So even if there's a slight incline, if I do this, I've now turned this into a bit more of an inclined bench press because I'm arching more. The problem is I'm actually jamming up my neck and I'm creating more problems in through the shoulder and the neck area. So if you're going to set up here and you're pressing, your press needs to be here. You shouldn't be really arching away from the bench. And you also want to avoid really driving your head back against the bench. And this is really true for a lot of exercises. When you jam the head back, you can create a lot of stress in the neck area. And when you press, it's a vertical pressing motion, right? So if I'm here, I want to be pressing straight up this way. So I'm straight here. A lot of times people's overhead pressing start to drift out in front of them. Whether or not they're aware of it is another story, but what you're doing is you're putting a crazy amount of stress on the shoulder the more it drifts out in front of your body. So make sure that your vertical or your overhead press is a vertical motion. Now, this will come all the way back to the things we've already talked about in terms of postural awareness, thoracic mobility, or even if you're stuck here and you're gonna end up drifting forward until you can get yourself back and you have that available range of motion. So make sure, go back and address those things we talked about prior to getting back to doing any kind of really heavy or consistent pressing, seated or standing. Now, let's talk about standing overhead presses. So say you do all of your pressing, no matter what kind you do standing, what can be some of the problems that you may encounter with standing? So obviously when you do a standing overhead press, there's more balance requirements, there's more stability requirements that you have versus when you're sitting. You also don't have the ability to push back against the bench for added stability. So you have to create that stability on your own, which can be part of the problem. A lot of times what I see and what is common is the low back really kind of gets, especially if there's limitations. If we're locked in here, people are gonna get really arching through here to try to press. Now, that could create problems for the low back, sure, but when the low back arches, right, so your lats, right, so take a look here, your lats run from the low back area, what's called the thoracolumbar fascia, up towards and it connects to the arm bone. So they have some role in overhead pressing motions, not directly, but indirectly, because when they're tight, they're gonna limit your ability to get here without arching the back. So that again throws off the mechanics of the entire body, because now the low back is arched, the hips are now kicked forward, and then it throws everything off here because now you're not in a good position here, you're compensating through here, and then your press is gonna be off from there. So that's one of the things that you typically see with that. And then the other things too is, I mentioned it in the seated video, is that the press actually starts to drift forward a little bit and it becomes more this way instead of there because you can't actually get to this position, right? Basically you get stuck, so then either the head has to jam forward or the back arches or the press kind of comes out, all of which are compensatory in nature and not desirable. So really, when you look at overhead pressing and standing, what I would suggest and what we're going to talk about is, making sure that you can lock everything in and that you're very aware of your low back position, even though it's not directly tied into shoulder pressing. It's an important component for setup. So make sure this is set first, whether you're pressing with a barbell, dumbbell, kettlebell, or whatever. Really control those things. And like I mentioned with the seated overhead press, you need to address the other mobility issues first. Get your postural awareness in check, both static and dynamic posture. Get your thoracic mobility in check. If it's not what it needs to be, address that. Get your soft tissue work in, then come back and revisit and sort of revamp your pressing technique. Don't just continue to press with lighter weight thinking that's going to solve the problem. Address the mobility things first, then come back and revisit your pressing technique. All right, so we've talked generally about a lot of different overhead pressing things, mobility things, seated versus standing. Now let's dive into the specific kinds or types of overhead pressing that you can do. So first we're gonna tackle the barbell overhead press. So what are we talking about? Take a look at this video here, the barbell overhead press. Basically you have a straight bar, you're pressing it from a low position here, up overhead. Okay, so if you have pain with barbell overhead pressing, it can be for a lot of different reasons that we've already talked about, but the other issue with the barbell, and this is true for anything you do with the barbell, is that it locks your hands and your shoulders into a very specific path of movement, right? So your hands are stuck here and they simply go up and down. With dumbbells, which we'll talk about, you have more variability. You don't have the variability with the barbell overhead press. This does not make it a bad exercise. It just limits the things you can modify to get out of pain. So the first thing I would suggest if you have pain with overhead pressing with the bar is to switch to a different version of overhead pressing. Now I'm assuming you've already addressed your mobility issues and that those are not the cause of your problem. But I would say take the barbell overhead press, put it to the side and work on one of the next couple options that I'm going to show you, because the barbell overhead press does limit your options in terms of varying the way you're going to press and the things you're going to do to get out of shoulder pain. Now, maybe you're partial to using the Smith machine for doing your overhead presses. If you're not familiar, this is what a Smith machine looks like. It's a bar that's attached inside like what looks like a squat rack. The bar is sort of unweighted, so it's not a completely normal weighted bar. It's also hooked onto tracks that run vertically. So with a barbell, you have the ability to move. You can press up, you can press out. With the Smith machine, it literally goes up and down on the tracks. You have even less variables to modify. So again, if you're having shoulder pain, I would advise against the Smith machine for similar reasons as the barbell overhead press, but actually you have even less to modify with the Smith machine. So again, I would hold off on that. It's similar enough to the barbell overhead press. I would say hold off on that for now. Try some of the other variations and then maybe come back to it later, or maybe just stick with some of the other options that I'm going to discuss. Let's talk about dumbbell overhead pressing, shoulder pain, and things you can do to modify this exercise to get you out of pain. So first things first, we have two main options here. You can go with the single arm overhead press with dumbbells. You can also go with a regular kind of 2 dumbbell approach to overhead pressing. Now, both are good. One is not necessarily better than the other, but when it comes to pain, what I would suggest is stick with the single arm version. Again, it allows you to work on things in a little bit of a different way than you get with 2. And sometimes just going to a single arm or a single leg movement is a great way to manage symptoms, because it allows you to focus on one thing at a time. Now, you also have options with the dumbbells you don't have with the barbell in terms of hand and sort of shoulder position. So with the shoulder, as I've kind of mentioned before, getting the arm up into this position is tough. A lot of people don't have that motion. If you think about that position going up against the wall and bringing your arms here, if you can't get there, then don't try to shoulder press like this, right? That's the problem with the bars. It kind of puts you here and it forces you to press from that position. So one of the things you can do is bring the weights in like this, so your elbow is forward, or maybe it's out to the side, maybe 45 degrees versus being 90 degrees out here, right? Play around with the position, because you may find that this does not feel good, but when you bring the arm in here, it's not so bad. So that would be one of the first things to look at with dumbbells. If you have pain with overhead pressing with dumbbells, and you've addressed all the mobility stuff we talked about, play around with the position, because the position is not right or wrong. It's more personal preference. So I know a lot of people that like to press out here, perfectly fine. I also know people that like to press more in here, also fine. It's more about what does your body tolerate the best, what feels the most comfortable to you, and go with that. Stick with whatever that thing is. You can play around with this. This is what's called a closed pack position for the shoulder, and it just brings a lot of things much closer together. The shoulder is, everything's right on top of one another in the shoulder anyway, so this position sometimes brings things and it really tightens up the shoulder, just all the structures in the shoulder, and it just makes it tough for people to do those kind of pressing motions. So play around with your elbow or sort of shoulder and hand position to find what works best for you with dumbbell overhead pressing. So let's talk about one of my favorite ways to overhead press, and that's using a kettlebell, doing what's called a bell up press. So what in the world is that? Why is it important? Why is it cool at all? So take a look here. So this is the sort of two kettlebell version of the overhead press on this side, and you have the single arm or bell up press on this side here. So the nice thing about the bell up press is that it forces you to do good reps. When you flip the bell up, you're gonna feel like the weight is dancing all around. It forces the muscles around the shoulder to stabilize in a different way compared to dumbbells. And again, it doesn't let you do bad reps, because if you do, the kettlebell takes off on you. If you get sloppy, that thing's gonna be all over the place. So it holds you true to good form and good technique. So again, doing both weights at the same time is great. I would recommend, if you're dealing with shoulder pain, go with one kettlebell and then work on becoming very strict, very controlled, you're gonna have to, because otherwise you're gonna feel that bell is gonna take off and you're gonna have a hard time. To that point, a couple quick things about the weight and what it can kind of do. If you're pressing and the weight kind of starts to come forward, you have sort of two things you can do. You can use the other hand to kind of catch it and kind of cradle it in, or you can kind of bring it down if you can kind of manage that through proper hip motion. If it starts to go out to the side or behind you, let the thing go, okay? Don't try to press up, have it go here, and then try to pull it forward and save it. You're gonna rack your shoulder. If your shoulder was hurting, it's gonna hurt worse. So do not save it. If it's going back this way, let it go and step forward. Do not try to save it. If it's coming this way, you can still drop it forward, but you have the other hand to kind of catch it this way. But if it's going this way or it's going that way, let it go and just get out of the way. So bell up pressing, it's gonna be less weight than what you would do with a dumbbell. So if you're pressing 45-pound dumbbells, you're gonna drop down, it's probably gonna be like a 25, 30-pound kettlebell, something like that, give or take. But it's gonna be a lot less. So it's not gonna be a pound for pound swap over. And you're gonna find if you have shoulder pain, you may notice that the painful side has a real difficult time stabilizing the weight, which to me just indicates how much it needs that. So I've used these a lot with both patients, clients, and a couple of times that I've had a couple shoulder issues to really help rehab the shoulder, because I like overhead pressing. I think it's a great exercise. The bell up press forces you to do good reps, and you'll notice that one side, it's not always the weight that's heavy, it's just the ability to stabilize the movement that really challenges you the most. But if you find that when you do the bell up press, that's great information. It means that there's something going on and the shoulder needs the extra stability, not necessarily the extra weight. So you might solve a couple problems at once by cutting back the weight and working on the stability. You reduce and eliminate irritating factors, which decreases inflammation and pain, and then you're strengthening and stabilizing the shoulder at the same time, which is going to help the rehab and help you feel better in the long run. Another great way to get some overhead pressing in when you have shoulder pain is to use kind of a landmine press or landmine setup, which if you've never seen before, it kind of has a base where the bar goes into it, and the bar can move in kind of different positions. I have mine kind of set up in a couple of plates on the floor, but what it does is that for somebody that has difficulty getting into this position, you can landmine press, because again, if you look at the motion here, it keeps me out in front of the shoulder. But because of the way the bar is situated and sort of the angle and the resistance, you're still getting that overhead pressing motion. And I can walk in further to get more and more motion, right? But I can find a comfortable spot where maybe straight overhead pressing is painful, but I can find a sweet spot with the landmine to get in and work on some pressing while I address other mobility issues or things like that. So the landmine press is great it's a great exercise, but especially when you're dealing with shoulder pain and trying to find a nice pain-free pressing pattern, this thing can be fantastic for that. And again, what you can set this up a couple of different ways. Sometimes, many years ago, you could put the bar kind of in the corner against something and just do it that way. You can buy a big kind of actual base that has a thing in it. Mine is a separate little piece that drops into a couple plates. You put the bar in, and then you can do all kinds of landmine exercises. And then mine's portable. It goes wherever I need it to go, as opposed to having it being attached to, say, a squat rack or something like that. So landmine presses are a great alternative if you struggle to get the arm straight overhead, but want to be able to do some overhead pressing pain-free.